Hello, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar. This is a Conexxus webinar on Petroleum and ISO20022 requirements for the next generation payment standards. Our agenda for today, and Sharon, if you could go to the next slide, thank you. Our agenda for today is I'll be presenting some housekeeping items. I'll talk a little bit about the presenters. I'll talk a little bit about Conexxus. We'll get to our main presentation, and then we'll have plenty of time for Q&A. Our housekeeping items this morning, just to let you know, the webinar is being recorded and it will be made available in approximately 30 days. It will go up on our YouTube channel, which you can see the address, which is also linked from our website, conexxus.org. The slide deck will be made available later this afternoon through an automated email that you'll receive. It'll have a survey link in there. 3 short questions, very easy to fill out, and when you're through with that and click submit, you'll get a link to the slide deck. All of you are in listen-only mode, but if you have questions, there's a question box where you can type in your questions. Please feel free to type those in as we go along. You don't have to wait till the end of the presentation, and I would ask that you don't ask vendor-specific questions. Typically for this kind of topic, we wouldn't have vendor-specific questions, but just in case we can't address anything with particular card brands, etc. If you're not on our mailing list already to get announcements of webinars, you can email us at info@conexxus.org, and we'll add you to that list. Our presenters today are myself, Linda Toth. I'm Director of Standards for Conexxus, and there's my email address, and I'm the host for today. We also have our main speaker, which is Sharon Scaife. She is the ISEC Technical Solutions Manager for WEX, and she's also the chair of our Retail Financial Transactions Committee. I want to tell you just a little bit about Conexxus. And Sharon, thank you. We are a nonprofit trade association. While we're affiliated with NACS, and we do a lot of things with NACS, we are an independent standalone organization. We do several things for the industry related to technology. We educate. For example, we do webinars like we did today. We advocate on behalf of the industry. One of the things that we do is work with outside organizations where they're creating standards and making sure that standards work with petroleum. This is one example that we're presenting today about advocacy. We're working with outside organizations to ensure that those payment standards work for petroleum. And we also create standards. Sharon, if you could go to the next slide for me. This is a list of our current webinars for 2016. You can see next month we have incident response plan, and then we've also just scheduled a webinar for September on guidance in preventing and detecting ATM skimming. So look for more information about that coming soon. The NACS show is coming up in October, and Conexxus partners with NACS in the Technology Edge section. So if you'll be at the NACS show October 18 through 21, please feel free to look us up in the Tech Edge Solutions Center. We also want to just remind you to save the date for our annual conference in 2017. The dates for that are April 23 through 27, and that will be held in Annapolis. So for today's presentation, we have a great speaker today, and that's Sharon Scaife. She's been actively involved in the payment and petroleum industry, as well as international standards organizations for over 12 years. According to her bio, she has over 26 years in the petroleum industry, so apparently she started as a teenager working in the industry. She works for WEX, which is the largest issuer of fleet cards. Previously, she worked for Amoco and BP, where she gained a wealth of payment knowledge, especially as it relates to 8583 and now 222. She's currently the Conexxus Retail Financial Transactions Chairperson, and we selected her to represent Conexxus when we did the work with Nexo and IFSF on behalf of Petroleum, and she'll discuss that work in a few minutes. So without further ado, I'd like to hand this over to Sharon, and she can give us her presentation.
Thank you, Linda. Hopefully I can live up to that reputation. Welcome, everyone, and good afternoon. The title is quite a mouthful: Petroleum and ISO20022 Requirements for the Next Generation Payment Standard. So we're going to break that down and explain what those different parts are. And we'll start with what is a standard and what is ISO20022. And interestingly enough, you'll hear people call it 20022 and 20022. I'll try and stay consistent. We'll talk a little bit about how are we working together with everybody who's involved in these standards. Where are we in the process? What are some new features that we can look forward to in the new standard? Okay. Starting with a definition, went to Webster's, and the definition of a standard is something established by authority, custom, or general consent as a model or example. And when we look at two people who want to play, for example, checkers, it's easy to set the standard on how you're playing. You're following the rules, or do you choose that you have to jump or you don't have to jump? It's very easy at that level. But when we talk about payment standards, it gets a little bit more complicated because of our complex landscape. We're not talking about two players here. We're talking about electronic payment, which covers magstripe, chip cards, mobile, RFID, NFC. We talk about consumer cards, fleet cards, gift cards, loyalty cards come into this space sometimes. We have issuers, acquirers, gateways. We have site systems such as point of sales, electronic payment servers, forecourt controllers. We have terminal providers. We have local requirements, and we have international requirements that we meet. So all of this needs to come together and work, because if you take your credit card and you cross the border into Canada, you want it to work the same way it did here in the U.S. You still want that transaction to work. You don't want to carry around pockets full of cash everywhere that you go. So how are we going to look at that? So there are standards organizations, as Linda pointed out. At the international level, we have the International Organization for Standardization. Now, they don't dictate. It's not a group of people sitting up there going, everyone shall do this. Countries participate in this to develop the standards. So it is work by committee, and they come together to say what's going to make sense. How can we make sure that this is going to work at an international level? But we also have more local bodies. Here in the U.S., we have X9, and you'll hear more about what they're doing in the financial industry. We have X9 that helps us work through our national requirements. In Europe, there's an organization called Conexxus. You may be familiar with EPAS and all of the work that they've been doing to create a unified system in Europe. Then we also work in the petroleum sector, where we have the International Forecourt Standard Forum in Europe and Conexxus in North America working together so that as petroleum, and we work very closely together on an international level, that petroleum standards are making sense. So we're going to give a brief history on the, going back to the payment space, since we're focusing on a payment standard here, and understanding how did petroleum fit into this. So back in 1987, what was approved was called ISO 8583. If you're not familiar with that, at the time, it was cutting edge. It focused on short messages because the communication connections were of a concern. How can we make sure we have the same information? So we used a bitmap structure to tell the receiver, these are the bits that I'm sending you. This is the information I'm going to send you. And then they expected to receive that information. And the goal was to keep the messages short and sweet. That went through an improvement in 1993. And in 1993, this is the work that a lot of petroleum work is based on. So IFSF did some derivative work off of this. some additional work was done in the U.S. It started out as a Technical Guideline 23, and this is where X9 fit into the picture. Technical Guideline 23 said, okay, on top of this financial message called ISO 8583, we want to communicate some information particular to the petroleum industry. Specifically things such as my sales item. I want to say 10 gallons of regular gasoline at $2 a gallon for $20. And how would we communicate that? It continued on to say, how would I communicate prompting information in the fleet card industry? How do I represent a driver ID versus an odometer? That sort of information was included. That actually came out and turned around to be a full standard called X9104-2, which was revised in or reaccepted in 2011. Now this is a national standard that actually has a lot of international applicability. Remember when I mentioned IFSF, there are a lot of elements that are in X9104 that IFSF is also utilizing. Well, ISO 8583 also went through another update in 2003. Continued to evolve with what was changing in the industry. As we all know, though, standards are very difficult to make changes to. So, as we decided we needed to make a big change, not only had the payments industry really been changing, but the infrastructure that the payments are running on has changed. And so ISO took a look at this and said, it's time to make a new standard to take advantage of what we know now, and that's ISO20022. When you think back in 1987, for those of you who were doing development projects then, versus how you do them now, I think most of us would agree we wouldn't do them exactly the same way we did them then. Technology has improved, the data that we want has improved, the demands on the data has gotten much greater. So that's why we're looking at a new standard. And one thing to add to this picture is locally there were IFS changes and there were enhancements and Conexxus enhancements. I talked about how do we express that there was 10 gallons of regular fuel at $2 a gallon. How to express that regular gasoline became a question. In some environments, it was just agreed upon by the sender and receiver. As it got more complicated, Conexxus stepped in, and we have the payment system product codes to help alleviate some of the confusion that was happening across those. So, what is this 222 that we're talking about at the end of this picture? This is our eye chart, the one slide that has too much text on it. To summarize what this is saying is ISO 20022 was developed to use XML, or extensible markup language. So where ISO 8583 took advantage of needing to be very short, sweet, and to the point, in ISO 20022 we could take advantage of communications had improved, and we could be a bit more expressive. We could include more information in the message. We were looking at industries that were crossing boundaries. So financial transactions before that were really just banking transactions were becoming more complicated because there were other entities that were involved in these transactions. And we could start including all of that information into the transaction. So the very first version was published in December of 2004. And as most first-level standards, it still needed a little bit of work to keep it going. My apologies, the screen just disappeared on us. Okay, so that was the start of 222. So the first question is ISO 8583 like the dinosaurs, and is it dead yet? So it's an older specification. 16 years ago, I sat across the table from someone selling a loyalty program, and they had described that this was brand new technology, not like COBOL, which was the programming language of the dinosaurs. And at the time, I was programming in COBOL, and I literally blurted out, "Are you calling me a dinosaur?" No, I'm not calling anybody a dinosaur in here. ISO 8583 isn't dead. It isn't going extinct. It's actually all 3 versions of ISO 8583 are alive and kicking today, which has been a very interesting process. We're in the ISO community, they're actually updating all of the versions of ISO 8583, which is very unusual. Usually you would only update the very last version. But different industries settled on one of them and didn't find a compelling reason to move to the next version. And so some things that have come out recently, such as tokenization, they wanted to be able to support while the industry is prepared to move to 222. So there's been work to go back and update those to support tokenization and ensure a better alignment for a smooth transition to 222. So going back a little bit to ISO 8583, many implementations have used private fields. That was one of the ways that we would be able to innovate. It was one of the ways that different industries could take basically a banking standard and make it their own. So anything that we did in X9104 was really in a proprietary field at the national level. One of the things about 222, the goal was, let's not have private fields. Let's make this very interoperable and everyone knows the data that's being passed back and forth. The other question was, when is the right time to start transitioning? There has to be a compelling reason to make a transition from one specification to another. So I want to take a look at the transaction flow and where are these specifications used today. So we have the cardholder who will interact with a point of sale, an electronic payment system, a forecourt controller, a site system. And then a message will pass to an acquirer, often referred to as a point of sale to host message. And the acquirer will pass something on to an authorization host or an issuer, typically on what's called a host-to-host message. So for example, IFSF actually did derivative work for point of sale to host and host to host. Now in your environment, one or both of these may be proprietary. Typically point of sale to host is proprietary, but there are implementations of 8583 in both of these environments. So when we look at 222, point of sale to host is replaced by what's called CAPE, the Card Payment Exchange. So that's taking the card information and passing it on to the acquirer. The host-to-host message is replaced by what's called ATTICA, or the acquirer-to-issuer card message. So we still have 2 flavors, so to speak, of 222. We have the ones that are going to focus on site systems to the acquirer, called CAPE, and those that go from the acquirer to the issuer, which are ATTICA. So how close were we? On the picture, it looks really close. So we want to know how close are ISO 8583 and ISO 222, because when you make the change, you want to make sure that you have all the functionality that you used to have. But it's not enough to have all of the same functionality. There needs to be a compelling reason to make a move. Otherwise, you're going to stay where you're at. I mean, you could have a compelling reason just because it's easier to support, or there's a compelling reason because it's offering you something more that you couldn't do in ISO 8583. So we sat down, and first we're looking at the question of how close are they? And 4 years ago, when we first took a look at this, they weren't very close. So similar to cooking a recipe for chocolate chip cookies. And everybody has their family recipe, but you have your basic ingredients, your flour, your eggs, your butter, your chocolate chips, very important. We wanted to make sure everything that we could do in ISO 8583, and the goal at first was to start with 2003, was there. And we knew that the rule was no more private or future use fields. So this told us that we needed to do 2 things. We needed to make sure everything that we as an industry in petroleum had added in everything we had done in X9104. Could we still do it in this environment? And was everything that we were already doing there? And that led to some interesting things where we learned some private use fields that we had in ISO 8583-1993 hadn't carried forward. So we had a little bit of background work to do to get some things brought up to speed in that area. And when we went through it, the recipe appeared to be missing a little bit of flour. So we couldn't make our messages stick together the way that they should have. There were gaps. So we went back and we noted the gaps to the committee, and we noticed that these industry specifics were missing. And at that time, the U.S. in specific, in replying back on where ISO20022 sat for us, said it's not ready for prime time. In the Conexxus, we said we have some work to do to make sure that when this is ready for prime time, it's actually ready for us as an industry. So a couple of years passed, specification was improving. Conexxus, IFSF, and Nexo started to work together to close the gaps. And some of you might wonder, well, why is Nexo, as a European body, focused on this? They actually are the authors of the document. So we were working with Nexo on getting our changes included. There's a step in the process where you work with the editors of the documentation. Then the documentation needs to go forth to a registration authority that needs to validate that everything works as expected. Everything is clearly explained. So Conexxus, IFSF, and Nexo work together to close these gaps and bring forth the petroleum-specific information. And our starting point was using ISO 8583-1993, because that's where IFSF had started, and TG23 looking at X9104 as well. And there are a couple of things, of course, that we focused on. One was this product sales information. How am I going to give a fuel transaction, because it's different than a banking transaction where you're just transferring money. We wanted to be able to say what was in that basket. The second piece of information that we wanted to do was to talk about fleet information. What is the prompting information that we're doing? What are the product restriction information that we needed to pass? And this came out very interesting because some other industries that were a little bit ahead of us in here, particularly in the banking area, their prompting information were things that we would never have thought of prompting for, such as alien ID number. Not saying that we would use it, but we were able now to see what some other industries were doing and say, does it apply? And we actually went through the exercise of, do these fields apply to us or do they not apply to us? And that work is going to come out in what's called the MUG, or the Message User Guide. Here are all of the fields and the ones that in your particular industry apply. The second item here that we talked about were product restrictions. This is something that internationally we actually didn't have a single solution for. In Europe, it was very common that the point of sale would send up the transaction in a pre-authorization situation and ask, is there money in the account and what may I buy? And the transaction is returned to say, yes, there is money in the account. You can spend 50 euro. And by the way, you can only purchase these 5 products. And then the point of sale would only allow those 5 products to be purchased. Where in the US, it was more common. There were 2 models that were more common. One was more card-based. The point of sale read the card and said, oh, this card only allows fuel, and therefore it would only allow fuel before sending the transaction up. Or the point of sale would send up all the products, and the host would then respond back, yes, there's money, and by the way, yes, you can buy all of these products. So it's interesting to make sure that both of those scenarios could then be supported in a single standard. And I'm happy to say, yes, we did come up with how to do that. Nobody has to make a major change. So where are we today on these messages? So the CAPE messages, those terminal to host messages, were the first ones that we worked on. That happened to be the document that they were working on last year. And it took us most of 2015 to define them. They were accepted in April of 2016, and now we're getting started on the message user guide. And message user guides are typically dependent on your industry. So we're going to have one petroleum message user guide, but we do recognize that there are going to be areas that are unique to different implementations. We're currently involved in the Attica messages, the host-to-host messages, which are being defined this year. We expect that that would be accepted in 2017 if everything goes to plan, and then there'll also be a message user guide for the Attica messages. Okay, so what's new? What are some reasons that we might want to even look at going to 222 instead of staying where we are in 85, 83? We definitely have enough other stuff going on in the industry. One is learning from other industries. We are one of the first specialty industries to get involved. Hospitality hasn't been included yet. Grocery hasn't been included yet for any specific requirements that they might have. Transportation is starting to take a look at this. So these are areas where we actually start overlapping, and we try and work with those industries. So this gives us some common language to start using when we talk to them. And it lets us see, are there some things that they're doing that maybe we could take advantage of. The second item here is improved traceability. So today in an ISO 85 message, you typically know where the message started, where's the site. You typically know who is the acquirer, and you know who is the issuer. But there are a lot of environments out there where there's more than just those two stops. You may have gateways in between. You might be going to a loyalty host in between. And in 222, there's a capability of listing anyone who touched that transaction, all of the different layers that they touched. So you can see that traceability in the transaction if that's something that's important to you. The third item here is device management messages. Today, most of these are defined in the ATM environment. True financial messages were the first ones that were worked on. But these are looking into being able to pass parameter information down on how a system should react, or passing information, diagnostic information up on how is the system acting. And in the financial area, and now that we need to pass more information like that, it's an opportunity for us to take a look at this and compare it to some of the work that we've been doing for immediate needs we have on device integration and messages that we've been passing back and forth. Okay. What about innovation? One of the things that I mentioned earlier is the private use fields. And coming from a company that does extensive modifications in the private use fields, it's a concern because many of us, that's how we've tried things out to see if they work. And sometimes we've had to go back to the drawing board and try something else out before we wanted to release it. So we don't want to lose our ability to do innovation. So one item we can now share between industries for best practices. Is there something we can learn from another industry that might help us? Secondarily, the overall standard is taking a look at revisiting other data extensions to foster innovation, having short spaces of information with the intention that it's temporarily used to allow you to go ahead and try something, see if it works, and then if it makes sense, add it to the standard in the next cycle. As I mentioned, and it looks like it takes a long time to go through the cycle of editing the document, going through the registration authority, and coming out on the other end with an approved standard. The other data field allows you to go out there, practice, see if it works, makes sense, and then go through that process rather than going through the process first and then doing your innovation. Okay. So in summary, ISO20022 is becoming the next generation payment standard. It is not quite ready for prime time in our industry. We're still working through that. Sometimes it feels like on the bleeding edge of doing that. So we're developing the message user guides for both the CAPE and the Attica messages, and we're providing input to the Attica messages. And we're working to be prepared for that transition. So if you're moving from an 8583 to a 222 message, what would it take to do that? But some things that we still need to think about as an industry in planning this transition is, am I using any proprietary fields that need to be incorporated? Your acquirer can let you know if you're doing something that's off the standard if you don't have a copy of the true ISO 8583. And I will tell you, the first time I did the exercise, I didn't realize how much proprietary information that we'd been using. And this wasn't just the work of what was WEX doing. I do want to be clear about that. The first group was actually acquirers and issuers sitting down around the table and going through and doing this effort. We had a lot of input on what was being done across the board at the acquirer level so that we had more input than just one company. There's a question of what are the new features that we find valuable? What are the things that we do want to carry forward and would make sense so that there's a reason for us to go here? And then that question of how quickly does this need to get done? Is it something to put in your work plan for 2017? No. I think in the U.S., and this is my opinion, I think in the U.S. we're really going to be taking the lead from the major brands, the MasterCard and Visa of the world, that when they start to move to 222 in the retail space, that's when we need to be ready to move. So right now we're laying that groundwork so that when it is time to move, we aren't scrambling to get a true petroleum message across this new standard. And so now I'm going to open it up for questions.
Thanks, Sharon. So if anybody has questions, please type them in the questions block there, and we'll get to those as they come in. We do have a couple that have come in, and Sharon, I actually have a couple of questions for you as well. So much of the preliminary work for ISO 20022 seems to have happened in Europe. I mean, that's where the documentation, the editors are, et cetera. So are they further ahead in terms of implementation, or can you describe sort of where the U.S. is compared to Europe?
Yes. Are they ahead of us? They are, not particularly to our industry. The first focus of 222 was cross-border, large dollar amount transactions. So it was really a bank-to-bank type transactions, and make sure that those would work. And Europe is using that in that capacity today, and the U.S., according to an article in payments.com this morning, or Monday morning, is looking at that. We haven't made the move there yet, but we are definitely looking at those messages. But yes, Europe is ahead of us in deployment.
Okay, great. So a couple of questions that have come in here. My acquirer has a proprietary interface. So what impact does ISO 20022 have on me personally, my systems?
So the short answer is it depends. And the longer answer is, as the acquirer and the issuer start to move to 222, there tends to be a ripple effect on what needs to be available in a proprietary interface so that you can take advantage of new functions and features. It's at that point that those proprietary interfaces might be looked at for change, or they may not be looked at for change. So it would really depend on the acquirer's decision.
Okay, thank you. The next question is concerned with so you indicated that all changes need to be approved, additions need to be approved. So what happens if I request something to be added and it's not approved? What do I do then?
We actually had a lot of concern about that when we were getting started. The nice thing about the process, and if you can say that about doing committee work sometimes, the nice thing about the process is you're working with an editor, and there's been a lot of communication through that process on what is trying to be accomplished. It's not giving away all of the details on how something's being done, but more of the purpose and intention of the fields. And so when we first went, and there were a couple of fields that were definitely declined, and we went back through and gave the business rationale for them, then our editor could make the same argument to the registration authority that we could make. And the registration authority wasn't looking to decline things, they just wanted to make sure we had thought them through. So one of the pieces that I've learned that you need to take forward when you're bringing something there is to have a definition for it, because once it's defined, then it's more widely accepted because it's thought through. They don't think that you're just adding something to add it. If after that point it still gets declined, then what we did is we had more support for those fields to say, no, it really is used. And the fact that something is used is very strong at getting it included. It's not a guarantee, but it's a very strong indicator that we can get it included.
Okay, thanks. So the next question is, how does one get involved in the effort?
Well, there's lots of ways of getting involved in the effort. The first piece to getting involved in the effort is getting involved at the petroleum level with Conexxus. Organizations can also join at the X9 level to participate. I'm sorry, was I cutting you off?
I'm sorry, what?
Okay, no, I thought somebody else was saying something, and I was cutting them off. Sorry. Getting involved at the X9 level to bring issues there. I'm trying to think of some other ways of getting involved. We definitely try through Conexxus to keep in contact with what is going on and making sure everyone is aware of it. And Alan Seaman carries much of this forward for us. You have something to add, Linda?
No, I was just going to say, if you want to get in touch with us separately, either you can email Sharon or myself, and we can point you in the right direction as well. So Sharon, the next question we have is, how do CAPE and Attica relate to the SEPA-specific messages in ISO20022? And basically, does SEPA cover both CAPE and Attica, or is it a separate set?
So, to the best of my understanding, on the SEPA messages, they will be utilizing 222. I don't know that that transition has been fully made yet, so I would need to do a little research and come back on that one.
Okay. The next question is, why will card brands drive adoption versus acquirers and processors?
So, the catalyst for change is somebody asking for the change to happen. And unless an issuer or a card brand such as MasterCard or Visa, where there's a lot of volume and they found this to be important to them, drives the change, we don't currently see another reason that moves us from getting from 85, 83 to 222 in the petroleum space. The infrastructure is there. People are able to do what they want to do right now. Now, if there's some huge change that we can fit into 222 that we couldn't put back into 85, 83, that might change the game. But at the moment, the functionality really needs to be driven by somebody saying, we have to move forward on 222.
Okay, thank you. The next question is, can I use other extension fields and not worry about including my private data into the specification?
And the pause is, well, that depends. The extended fields are very limited in how they've been proposed, and so you'll quickly run out of space compared to doing it there from an innovation perspective and then moving it into the standard and then having that space to use again. So it's there to encourage us to do innovation, but not to start creating all of these very, very private interfaces again.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So we have another question here on the iChart slide. It mentioned that the message format is XML. What are the other options that could have been considered, or is XML the only option?
So they're also looking at ASN1, and I think that that's actually been included in the latest release. And they continue to see if there are other technologies that they should take advantage of. But when they started, XML was the best option. So I think we're going to see some evolution in that space. That 222 is really intended to be more of a data dictionary of all of the fields that we want to use, and that underlying architecture on how we transport it is expected to evolve. Where in 85-83 we made sure that the two are in lockstep with each other. Does that help?
Okay. I'm not sure. I didn't ask the question. All right, we've got another question here. In terms of moving extensions into the main spec, can you tell us what role the RMG plays?
The R.
Which I think is the other body that does like the registrations, maybe? I'm not sure. I've heard that term, but I don't know what it stands for.
Right. I've heard the term, and I'll have to get back and answer on that question.
Okay. Okay, it looks like that's it for questions that we have. So Sharon, if you could just go to the next slide for me. First, I want to thank Sharon for doing this webinar today. We learned a lot of really valuable information about future payments and where they may evolve. To get more information, you can visit our website. You can email info@conexxus.org. We have a LinkedIn group, and we're also on Twitter. And as a reminder, our next webinar will be in August, and it's on incident response plans. I think registration is open for that one, and you should be getting some information shortly if you haven't already. So anyway, again, thank you for participating, and Sharon, thank you for your time and expertise today.
Well, thank you for your time.
All right, thanks everybody.